Women on a Green Mission. Follow along as two friends document their unfurling permaculture journeys.
Join our chats each week where we'll be sharing how we and others apply permaculture to our gardens and daily life.
We're no experts. We're at the start of our journey, fumbling our way to a greener life. We'd love your company along the way.
Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. We're getting blown away here today.
It's just picked up here. We've spent the morning at the beach. They've got the farmers markets on a Wednesday morning here in Yamba.
Oh, that sounds so
Farmers
nice.
markets, yeah. So we met our little bush kindy tribe down at the beach afterwards, and it's like a little tucked in spot where the wind isn't too bad. So we spent all morning there and then came home and we're having like a little lazy afternoon because we just had a really busy day. Like, yeah, got home. Oscar was like working. We had arborists here and it was a bit crazy. We just took a few more trees down to open up some areas for planting. So that was good.
Nice. So what are you doing with the trees? Have you chipped them or?
Yeah, they've all been mulched. So the longer, skinnier logs we're going to use as garden bed edging because the grass is starting to creep up already onto my garden beds. And I was like, I need some kind of hard edge to kind of
it's like,
have
no,
a
you don't.
boundary to stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't have enough comfrey or anything else to plant along them for the time being. So yeah, they're just going to be edged in wood and we'll see how they go for termites and stuff. I'm not quite sure. And then the rest of it, all got mulched, and then they left some of the bigger stuff again for firewood.
Oh, nice. So multi uses for what's come down.
All gone to its highest purpose kind of thing. Yeah. And a few of them actually I think were used for the espalier ends as well.
Oh, yeah, that's a great use.
Yeah. So I haven't had a really good look at what they did because I kind of had a few things I had to get done before we recorded. But so I'll go have a look and see what they've left me. And yes, and it kind of maybe might change my plans a little bit as well because we haven't planted in where the orchard's meant to be going, the apple and pear orchard, and now they've opened it up. There's just so much more sun, and I was thinking it might be better off to be a veggie bed, and I can move them somewhere else because they'll need the chill hours anyway. So we're not going to plant that anyway until next year, but I think if we're going to use it for veggies instead, I might plant it maybe for spring. So
like
many
a rolling
seedlings.
site sector analysis so that you can just keep observing, see what's happening. Yeah,
I think it's really going to change things. So I've kind of had a good look this afternoon and then I'll go out again tomorrow and at lunch and we'll see because the sun's only going to get higher from here. So it'll be interesting to see the effect it has on our plans and what we change. But and how about you?
Forever changing. Yeah, well, we've had a heap of mulch delivered as well. So we've got a local arborist who said that he's always got a little bit of excess because people will say they want it, and then he shows up a week later and they're like, oh no, we wanted it last weekend, not this weekend. He's like, well, that's not how it works. Like, depends on jobs that I've got. So I've just said, anytime that you've got spare mulch, just drop it in and I'll, drop some cash off to you. Live locally. We've had 2 big loads. We've almost been through one. So not last or this weekend, the weekend before, we smashed out a ton of path mulching because it was so wet here. Like, we've now got the August winds. Before that, it was just slop. It was so bad. And like, we were slipping in it. The dogs were slipping in it. And they were just like spraying mud everywhere. And so we were like, oh, do we mulch it? Do we not? Because, if you mulch it, you got to maintain it. And then we just went, no, fuck it. This is just too hard. Like, we've got the mulch. It's super cheap. It's green as, so we don't want to be putting it on, in the gardens or anything like that. So that is the perfect use for it. Let's just get it down. So we put like it would be almost like a 200 mil layer of mulch down. It was really, really thick. So, and I've actually been out there walking on it in bare feet, and it's lovely. I'm not getting mud through my toes. So that's.
How long do you know how long you're meant to leave mulch for before you don't get nitrogen drawdown?
I don't think there's really a time period. I think it's more that once it's sort of dried out enough, like once it's finished sort of its little bit of, I I say curing, for want of a better term, 'cause it's not really composting as such, but it's like when you cure
Gardening.
firewood, like it just takes that time to actually dry out the moisture and any heat that would be in there as well. So any activity from that drying process, which obviously causes heat, and once that's sort of calmed down as well, we sort of leave ours. I mean, to be honest, I've put it on their green sometimes, and depending on the garden and the trees, or whether it's in your veggie garden or whatever, as to the effect that it has. I've put it on my fruit trees green, and there really hasn't been an issue. But I wouldn't put it in my say like my annuals bed or something like that while it's green. I'd leave that probably 3 months, and I'd be scooping just all the stuff off the top and down around the edges and stuff. I wouldn't be digging into the middle of the pile.
Because we've got obviously a lot of new stuff, but I always wondered like how long I should leave it, because we've been putting it on our fruit trees, but I actually top them up with rooster booster before I put it on, so it kind of counteracts that nitrogen drawdown effect. Well, in my head it does. I don't know if it really does.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's just trialing and erroring and seeing what works. Like when I first started doing it, I really didn't understand what nitrogen. I'm still not completely understanding of exactly what happens. But I know that it can be cause a nitrogen deficiency because it is so green and it's still heating up and going through its process. So, but yeah, I used to use it all the time, and not really had that much of a detrimental effect. But in saying that, I didn't exactly take notes either. So, it could have been that something died, and I was like, oh no, that was me because I didn't water it or something, and it could have had that impact. So. But yeah, look, it is, wood chip around here is life. Like he said, he goes, I've delivered here before. I said, yeah, mate, like we've bought from you quite a few times. He goes, yeah, because we've had, a friend of a friend sort of arrange it. And he goes, man, you must have really good soil by now. You would have put a lot of this stuff into your garden. And I'm like, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Like I said, whatever you've got, keep it coming. So yeah, we've had
that's what these guys said. They were like, they're like, you're not going to go through this. And I was like, mate, we've already gone through 3 of this already.
Hold my beer.
And he was like, no. He was like, no way. And I was like, yes. I was like, we had trees cut down and then another big one that was dangerous. I was like, and then we got 3 piles delivered that weren't from our block. They were from somewhere else. And we've gone through all of those. He's like, man, you must go through some mulch. I was like, yes, we do.
Funny. It is. Yeah, you can't have too much of it. Like, when people turn it away, and I'm like, are you nuts? Are you kidding me? Like,
I know.
I get it. Look, some people have got really small properties. They just don't have the room for it. So I'm like, mind you, I had to tow him out because it was so wet when he dumped it off that. Because I'm like, can you just back it up and put it next to the other one so it's sort of out of the way of our main thoroughfare, because we needed to get the ute up to the paddock for horse feed and stuff. And he sort of got it halfway up to where he wanted, and then it just went and just sunk. And he goes, oh, is here okay? And I'm like, I guess so, because you're not moving. Like you've got a full load. And he goes, you're going to have to tow me out. So yeah, he dumped the load, and then we put the snatch strap on, and the little LDV that everyone writes me off about, going, that's not a real 4-wheel drive. Yeah, she pulled it straight out, so off he went. But yeah, our paddock is now so chewed up.
He would have been a bit lighter at least on the way out as well.
Yeah, a lot lighter. And yeah, once it was tipped, like all the weight was in the back. But yeah, it was really good. So yeah, I'm keen for some more to come in. We've still got 1.5 piles, but the more that we get, then the longer that we can leave it. So, and then Ant's got last weekend, because I've been out of action for a little bit. He got the duck dome, I'd say 60%, 70% done. So we've got the dome was already wide, but then we've got the side walls in, they're wide off, we've got the doors on. So yeah, now we just need to put the roof on it to protect it from the crows, and then put the predator proofing wire down the bottom. So we're going to do a 900 high wire, a really small aperture, and then do 450 up the sides, and then 450 onto the ground, and then put pavers over the top, and then mulch over the top of that. So
nice.
And then the ducks will have their fully predator proof enclosures, so that they'll still be out roaming, all day, every day. But if we're away, for a short period of time, like a weekend or something, we've got someone that's not okay with herding ducks every night, then they can stay in the
Mm.
dome. And
Yeah,
also
it's not
during
big enough.
summer, they don't have to stay in the coop at night. Like chickens are different. They go in, they roost. Turkeys are the same. But
Mm.
ducks don't necessarily want to be, stuck in a warm coop at night. So this way they can still be out, have their little paddling pond and all the rest of it. So
Yeah.
yeah, so we got some progress happening
That's
there.
good. Exciting.
Yeah. And is the garden all coming to life now? You guys will be having some warm temperatures.
Oh, yes. We were just saying on our walk yesterday, I think it was, or day before, we go for a walk in the morning with our coffee a couple times a week. And when you get the new growth and it's just that different color compared to the old growth, and we were
Mm-hmm.
like, wow, look how much it's all, because we had a couple days where it rained in the afternoon/night. So we've had beautiful hot days with lots of sun, and then some wet coming in, and they've just all been given this massive boost. So yeah, everything's really grown, a good couple centimeters in like a week. It's
Oh,
crazy. And
so
the
good.
veggies are just, now really coming into their own. We planted things a bit late, so like we're getting all our broccolini coming in, and all of our Asian greens are just going to seeds. We're having to plant all of that. We've got so many seedlings at the moment, like so many that need to be put in or find some room somewhere for them. But yeah, it's cool. Like at the end of spring, it'll be really interesting to see how much bigger our hedge has gotten, because there's just so much new growth on everything. We're just trying to get all the irrigation sorted so that when we don't have the rain, that it doesn't suffer.
Oh,
Mm.
speaking of irrigation, that's the other thing that's happening. Um, so we have come into a 2,500 litre tank that we can have that we're being gifted. So
Oh.
happy. So that's going to go up to the shed, which means that we now have to fix the gutter. So that's going to be a priority,
Yeah,
which means that's going
yeah.
to stop a lot of the erosion in the paddock. But also, we're
Cool.
getting a ton of wheelie bins, and we're going to be using the wheelie bins
Cool.
for water storage. So,
So put the water into each one.
pardon?
To put the water into each one, like in a succession kind of thing, or
Yeah, yeah. So we'll just basically have, like, if we want to do water for the chicken coops, we'll put two wheelie bins, and then we'll just put a hose connection between so that the water comes up and down equally in each of them. And
cool.
I'm like, that's an awesome use, because the problem we've had, like we've got IBCs here, but because they're white and um, they can still let UV light through. Of course, you need to either paint them or cover them up, otherwise they get slimy. So I mean, we've got like 3,000 liters of water here that we can use for the gardens. It's gross, like you wouldn't give it to the animals to use, and it's certainly not potable for
Yeah, yeah,
us. So we thought,
yeah.
well, why don't we upcycle those as wicking beds so that,
Yep.
at the height of summer, if we just want to let the gardens go and just go wild and do whatever, we don't have to worry about keeping, our lettuce leaves green and crispy or anything. We can just use the wicking beds for those. And then we use
Yep.
these wheelie bins as water containers. And I'm like, oh,
Cool.
that is awesome. So
Yeah.
yeah, that'll be
Awesome.
a good little project.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, exciting.
It
Well,
is.
um, this week I ended up speaking to Andrew.
I know.
So Joe
I'm
was
so
out this week.
bummed I missed it, but yeah, I was out. I was
No.
out for the count this week.
It probably would have been a good one for you too, because a lot of it was animal related, which was a bit over my head. But I think I learned a lot, because it's just not something that I kind of know that much about. So I asked him a few questions, and so Andrew has a sheep farm in Bulahdelah. And we talked to him about how he's come from like farming out west to being on a coastal farm, how he thought the rainfall here would be like a big benefit to him, and how it's actually been something that he's had to manage because he's not used to it. We had a good chat with him, and he's like full deep into permaculture, but it's cool to see it on such a large scale because he's got 100 acres there. And he did Brett's course, and he's good mates with Brett, and he actually delivers some of the PDC as well, which we talked about. It was just nice to get a really different perspective, and someone from like a farming background that's implementing permaculture and how he's integrating that on his property. So yeah, it was a really cool chat. I did get a coughing fit though, Joe, halfway through.
Oh no.
And he's like, poor Andrew, he can see me coughing and I've muted myself and he's trying to just keep talking and cover for me. And I was like, oh, bless you, Cotton. We can edit this out, Andrew. So if you watch it on YouTube, yeah, you'll see me like coughing and crying from like coughing tears in the background while Andrew just keeps talking.
So when I watch that, I'll just go, okay, I'll just leave Elise to die over there for a bit. I'll just focus on Andrew and
yeah. This is where it would have been handy to have Joe.
So yeah, this is where having that second person, it's just nice and easy to bounce off and go, here, you take the wheel. Yeah, so it would have been really good to be there for that one, but life happens, right? We can't get to do everything and be involved in everything. So thank you so much for picking up the slack there, and I'm really looking forward to listening to the interview along with everyone else.
Yeah, you'll have to give me some feedback.
I'll give you like a fill out like a little questionnaire. No, you're an awesome interviewer. I love listening to you.
Oh God, thanks. All right, well, let's get into it, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Catch you on the next one.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's podcast. It's just me today. Joe's recovering from an operation, and I'm here with Andrew. Hey.
G'day, Elise. Lovely to join you today.
Yes. Before we get too far into the podcast, we just acknowledge where we're recording. So we're about to you.
I'm down in Bulladila, and it's a bit hard to pronounce. Bulladila. It's down in the central part of the coast in New South Wales, north of Sydney.
Yeah, and do you know the local Indigenous people that were there?
No, I don't actually, and I sort of have interesting conversations with local people trying to find those sort of things out. It's it's sort of quite a nomadic side of things. So, and what's sort of left here has been hard to track down, I suppose.
Yeah, right. I know in Port Stephens, I grew up there, and there's a couple of different peoples that kind of lived in that area. So you're not too far off there, are you?
No, we're just sort of across the bay, I suppose you'd call it. So, short fly, but a long drive sort of thing.
Yeah. And I'm up in Yagle country in the Northern Rivers. So, I guess to start with, can you tell everybody about who you are, what you do, your kind of context and background for where you are?
Well, we run a small sheep operation on the coast here. It's sort of a few miles inland, but very affected by the coastal climatic patterns and rainfall. So we're traditionally a Western farming family. So we sort of came across a bit of family succession. Try something different. Go farm where it rains all the time because that'll make life a lot easier. And found out that's not exactly the case. So it's been an interesting learning process.
Yeah, sure. And so how long ago did you land your feet there in Bulladila?
About 8 years ago we moved here. Okay. So my wife and we're sort of travelling around doing various sort of videography and photography style, type of work. And we sort of saw the opportunity to sort of go back to our farming roots, our land roots, and try and approach it, I suppose, smaller but more intensively and just more considered in what we were sort of doing and how we were approaching it.
And so what was that approach before you got to Bulladila when you were out west?
Well, my dad was always been very involved with land care and considering the impact of his farming practices. And but the reality when you're dealing with wholesale farming, you're not as connected to your clients, I suppose. So you don't have that story that you're sort of sharing with them. So you're sort of very isolated. So moving over here to the population base, it's changed how we can market and how we can sort of directly impact and more directly connect with who we're growing our food for.
Yeah, sure. And you have a lot of involvement with limestone. That's how I met you guys. And so how did you kind of get into permaculture? And, was that like a slow burn, or did it just kind of slap you on the face one day? Like, how did it come into your life?
Well, I wasn't familiar with the concept prior to moving here, I'll be honest. And my wife one day said that I should go up to a limestone permaculture introduction day. And I was sort of, what the hell's that? Was my first response to that. And I'll probably give that a miss. But she sort of convinced my dad and I to say, no, you should go and give it a try, and went there, and never looked back, to be honest, as the cliche goes. But it was just really resonated with the processes, I suppose. I like to really sort of think through how and why I'm doing things, and making sure there's contingencies for things, and making sure you're connected, and observing. And that's, I suppose, when you find something you resonate with, it's very easy to adopt it. And that's what that came down to. So, and just being with someone like, fortunately to meet Brett, that was so pragmatic about it, I suppose. We sort of connected in that sense of, righto, how do we make this work? What does this do in our space? And remove any of the wishy-washy stuff. I'll be honest, it's a case, it's a direct enabling process. And that's things, really worked for me.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why I ended up dragging my husband along, because I knew that some of the permaculture courses are a bit woo-woo, or they kind of get, into that space.
Yep.
But Brett is so practical. He comes from that background of being, a manager. So he has, very good systems in place, and even to the point where he's like, we're going to make the bed this wide because the net comes in this length. Like it just makes sense the way he talks about it. So I think anybody who kind of has that similar thinking, it's a good stepping stone to get into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so how did you then start applying what you kind of learnt at Limestone? Because you're going on a commercial scale, like a lot of our listeners are either smaller urban patches or they do have property. But you're kind of that next level on that commercial scale. So, how did you then start implementing that?
Well, observation was the first, by a long shot. We sort of arrived, bought the property here, and spent the first 12 months just getting out in the rain, literally out in the umbrella and poking around and seeing where water flowed, and looking at the infiltration rates, and just seeing how stock patterns were. We sort of had the property for 12 months before we brought our sheep over. So we wanted to, we just got next door neighbours' cattle, and put them around the place so we could sort of observe the interaction and how they sort of areas and the impact and those sort of things that livestock have in your landscape. And so off that observational base, it gave us an opportunity to just slowly, incrementally make changes into the landscape, and where we sort of created paddocks and what we designated paddocks for, I suppose. We don't just sort of work as one sort of clean, from this is all our land, so we're going to operate under the same sort of paradigm. We sort of assess different paddocks as fields and how they're going to react to different sort of practice, I suppose. Some might be more intensive, and some are left more as remnant vegetation, and we can manage the impact more carefully within that. And then how all of the macro elements affect the landscape here. It's how do we, I suppose, set ourselves up to be more resilient long term, from the stuff that, and that's those permaculture principles of observation, then taking it through that process of then considering those impacts, whether it be sort of the sun sectors or the damaging winds, especially here. That's been one of our major things we've had to consider here, is how do we, I suppose, mitigate things. We're not under some illusion that we're going to build a bigger wall or stop things. It's sort of how do we harmoniously mitigate the effect those things have. It's a case of how do we accept that there's a certain point that we can't totally stop it, but how do we, as I said, mitigate it and go through that and try and average out the extremes a little bit.
Sorry, I was having a coughing fit as you were speaking. So when we did our course there and we came, next to where your paddocks were, you started getting some crops in. Are you looking at integrating those with the sheep, or is that kind of a separate thing that you'll be doing?
No, the cropping side of things has multiple functions on our property. Like, it's a matter of, a large part of it actually using it to choke out a lot of the rubbish and lower succession plants. We're trying to sort of build along, move ourselves forward in the fertility and the capacity for our sort of property to produce. And other times it's sort of filling in feed gaps at the natural sort of systems because of the extremes of the environment we face now. Massive feed gaps that we sort of face in spring when we're waiting for the summer and warmth to come in. We sort of none of our grasses here are that we've sort of selected out, over the time, in this sort of region, all of our winter active style of grasses, and just left with very summer active. So we're trying to sort of use the cropping to sort of fill that gap while we sort of move it up to succession to better perennial grasses that have a more seasonally diverse aspect in our farm. So the cropping side of things serves two functions. It's filling feed gaps for our livestock, and it's moving our sort of property forward. And it's also helping us to continue to grow stuff more of the year, to keep more green plant, green leaves in our system for longer parts of the year. One of the downsides to the tropical, subtropical pasture systems on the coast is you come into your first frost or your cooler seasons, you've got very senescent, just brown, dead grass everywhere. That's not feeding the soil. So we're looking at how do we utilise different sort of crops within that. To get us a full year round, and moving forward more rapidly, I suppose, to an end goal of more diversity in the system, and a more biodiverse and more complex system, I suppose, rather than the simplicity monoculture style that gets sort of encouraged by some systems on the coast of management.
Yeah. And you mentioned before when you moved, you thought, all this rain and the weather patterns would be beneficial. How have you found that to be a challenge, or what have you found unexpected about that?
Well, I suppose it comes from moisture being the most limiting factor of Western agriculture, where we come from. So you sort of think, well, we go somewhere where that's not a limiting factor, so to speak. It should be easy. But the problem is the system's designed for that to be continuous and regular. And because we've been so impactful in our landscape, removed so much of the trees and the capacity for that humidified air to stay stabilised in place, we're sort of losing air, and our whole systems are losing sort of moisture through the air, and it's not being recharged and replenished in a regular sort of reliable sort of pattern. So the coastal drainage that we live on, that's sort of high clays, and everything sort of very quickly moves to the ocean, which would normally be intercepted by tree canopies and things like that. So the whole system's designed for regular rainfall, and when we get sort of major rainfall events, then a few weeks or months without, the impact's quite marked. Whereas if we're out west, you're expecting those longer cycles. That's part of what all the ecology is actually developed around that. We've sort of we've sort of changed our coastal landscape so much that things aren't able to adapt, and it's made it more difficult because all of your natural species are working in an unnatural system. It's the reality of it.
And do you think that the permaculture, once you've done the course, that changed how you were also selling your produce?
Absolutely. I think you're never going to save the whole world, but you can save the people that are in your community, in a sense of being connected to them, and if we can sort of develop systems on the property to create that much higher nutrient density of food in our food, those that are interested and those that we're directly affected, can directly affect, benefit from it. And I suppose it creates that sort of feedback loop of being connected to your consumers.
Yeah.
And that's why we sort of put such a high regard on it. We're never going to look at trying to produce 1 million acres of food or replace any of the major food bowls. That's never what it's about. It might be if we can feed 20 families wholly and completely and healthily, that's an effective business model. By not moving to a sort of a monoculture and just working as a commodity-based system. We're sort of working as a food growth and a more holistic approach to it.
Yeah, and inadvertently, the food miles are going to be less because you're supplying your local community. You make those local connections and relationships as well within your community.
Absolutely. I think so much of all of our histories, regardless of your heritage, has been food centric, hasn't it? Like we've sort of considered that, and that's been part of it. And we're so disconnected from that now, and that's the reality of the modern world. We're not going to sort of deny that, but it's such a awesome thing to be able to enable if you can, and that's what I'm a bit about. If you can, you do. That's what it comes down to.
And people buy directly from you at Farmgate, or do you just supply local shops, or how does that work for you guys?
We're looking at over time. We've had different sort of models. The farm gate side of things has been difficult over the last few years, with obviously the COVID and the extreme weather events isolating us and things like that. So we've moved into more of a pattern of just supplying to a local shop with produce as available when it can be.
Yeah.
And putting a focus more on the longevity of the property, I suppose, and just building a client base of people that are regularly use our product rather than trying to constantly develop new clients.
Yeah, sure. And do you think that permaculture has also made you think about resilience within your business a bit more?
Very much so. It's very important to have diversity in whatever you do. I rarely get caught out, I'd like to say, because we do have always contingencies and always sort of considerations of multiple factors. I go into every aspect of life, with contingencies of what could go wrong. If you come into a simple podcast, for example, like, do you have control of that environment? Is there something that's going to come in? Is there noise that's going to affect that? Have I got backup headphones, for example, if required? Yes. So it's a case of just, I suppose, not being caught out.
Yeah.
And it's not that you can control everything. It's being considered, what is your plan if something else happens? And I think that's what it comes down to, being aware of different possibilities and you plan ahead for how you can react to that.
Yeah, sure. And when we were there talking about resilience, you guys have been also looking at different breeds of sheep.
Yeah, so we were traditionally a wool property for the last 100 years out west, and we've sort of moved, due to labour reasons and the real profitability of wool, I suppose, has become more and more difficult. Your input costs and stuff. So we moved to a pure meat sheep variety 5-10 years before we even moved over here to the coast. Yeah. So it was a fairly easy transition to bring those across here. And it just suits our landscape. So we're trying to develop those, sheep we sort of identified as something that's a nice mid-range product that has less impact in our landscape than the larger ruminants. For cattle, for example, when you're sort of getting heavy rain events continuously, well, heavier animals are going to cause more damage to the landscape. So it's a harder thing to manage, whereas sheep are a little bit more dainty, I suppose, and move around the worst spots. So selecting the breed that actually handles those conditions is important.
Yeah.
And just selecting the genetics that suit the coastal conditions of low fertility pastures and high worm burden capacity. So, there's a lot of reasons that make it more difficult. But I think it's around, selecting the genetics to suit gives us a long-term position that will enable us to be, minimise inputs. We're never going to 100% negate, I don't think, the need to occasionally drench certain animals. I mean, we have a responsibility for a living animal. I'm not going to live on a high horse and just hard line to anything. But you're trying to move towards a genetic pool that's going to be more resilient. We sort of we will go 12 months before we drench sometimes.
Yeah, right.
And that's around off genetic selection. Then you get to a point where there's an increased pressure, or things that the pasture quality is sort of declining, so their capacity to withstand it reduces. So you'd have to make that decision, but it's all about that observation, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a case of being aware of what's happening and not denying it. So I think that sort of selection of species is particularly important for a long-term sustainability. That's the reality of it.
Yeah. And obviously still being in contact with your family that are out west, do you think that some of your practices have rubbed off on them, or have you had those conversations about, practices that they could potentially incorporate as well, or are they kind of just doing it their own way and you guys are on your own path?
Well, I suppose there's always it's hard for people to take direct correlations between things. So it's a case of there's principles of it, but for the most part, people struggle without a direct parallel, I suppose.
Yeah.
So if we were sort of dealing with, it's all well and good for you, it rains there, and it's like, yeah, but that's actually my biggest problem. But it doesn't get, that doesn't get past that point. But it doesn't mean that, it's not a process. And I think that's what I think permaculture is about. It's about people accepting it when they're ready.
Yeah.
It's not about it being forced on you.
Yeah.
So, and that's like we only learn something when we're open and accepting to learning it, aren't we?
Yeah.
And that's just a human nature trait.
Mm.
So it's not that anyone's pushing against it, I suppose. It's just a matter of how that particularly is relevant to their circumstance and how they apply things. As that's how that comes down to, I suppose.
Yeah. And do you think what you're doing could be done on a larger scale if we're talking about, providing more food and being able to have more people access, meat that's ethical and meat that's, has these things in mind, that we're not impacting the land so much? Or do you think it's more of a case of more people having smaller, farms that can contribute to that system of food security?
I think there's both arguments to be had. We sort of look at our toy farm, I suppose, at 100 acres, but that sort of comes from a context of coming from bigger agriculture.
Yeah.
So whereas someone coming from the city considers 100 acres overwhelming.
Mm.
So it's a sort of a context-based how you approach it. And I think if our sort of concept here is as 100 acres, it's a certain level of scalability that's required there. You require mechanisation. There's certain things that are you have a certain critical mass of livestock numbers that you can create impact as necessary. So it sort of hit that tipping point that then whether it's 100 acres or 1,000 or 10,000, it's sort of it's principle based.
Yeah.
So that's where that scalability comes into it. But the flip side to it, as you say, if we had more people involved directly in food production, we return to that connection with it. And I suppose that sort of that disconnect from it's one of the biggest struggles we have. So yes, certain area, but then also like everyone can't move from the city to 100 acres. That doesn't simply work. So I think there's a matter of you have to have a foot in both camps for those that are prepared to, that want that lifestyle. And that's the reality too. Farming, it's hard. It's not easy. There's a lot of factors against you. So there's a reason we don't do subsistence farming anymore, because lots of people died of starvation. It wasn't great. So it's a case of, but the quality of things is reducing. So because of the food becoming a commodity, and it's just simply a race to the bottom often in prices, and a force to more of a monoculture-based system. So I think the important thing of scalability is working out how to add diversity to your system, how to have multiple things operating harmoniously together to a greater benefit of that whole. And that's certainly scalable. So that's something that can come into large-scale agriculture as well as a small homestead-style operation. And I think the homestead side of things takes it almost too far sometimes. They sort of end up running around chasing their tail with too much going on, and they're not sort of focused on doing the best of a few. They're sort of struggling to keep 100 balls in the air type of thing. So it's I think there's pros and cons to both sides, and it's also I think it's just a matter of being honest with ourselves about what they are. That's the reality of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's where that community sufficiency comes into it too, like if you're really good at bread and someone else is good at something else, you make those connections and you try and create that community that can provide for each other, rather than, like you said, doing it all and not doing it all very well.
Yeah.
Killing your sourdough starter because you've left it too long. And
yep. And that's the thing. I think building that community around is probably the main, one of the main things we need to look at.
Yeah.
Just removing egos from things and working out, we all enjoy different things. Like my next door neighbour milks a cow. Why the hell would I milk a cow? Like it's, it's why both be doing the same thing and then throw half of our milk out each. It's nonsense.
Yeah.
That's sort of that, using all and being able to share our excess, I think is the permaculture principle I really sort of look at. It's considering, producing more than you need in an ethical, meaningful way, and passing that on as a benefit to community.
Yeah, for sure. And so you guys do workshops with Brett, but do you do workshops on your own as well now?
We've never really sort of pushed for the educational side of things, but because we do such a variety of things here, it's sort of one of those things that it'd be a shame not to share it. So we've got a number of workshops coming up just around sort of drought resilience and multi-species cropping and just from a practical sense, I think there's a lot of ideology in things in the modern world, and there's less and less examples of someone actually doing it. And the simplicity of, rightio, that's all well and good, but now how do I do that? And to be able to see it in action, something with sort of pride in what we do here. So, and it is a case of, that didn't work well, and this is why, or you sort of might, as much as you can plan for things, there's still factors for why you're going to get a different result. And that's the beauty of coastal farming. You can do the same thing 10 times in a row and end up with 20 different results, it seems. It's a factor. It's being able to sort of have people on the property and actually go through the exact whys of that. This year, for example, we haven't seen the sun shine for 6 months. We haven't had any more rainfall, particularly, than any other year, but it's just been the lack of sunshine hours has dramatically affected the capacity for growth. And so we got poor results from certain crops last year because of the dry winter, that we didn't have runoff rain or, showed any runoff rain to show those major rain events for a year. So, and then this year the rain comes, doesn't seem to stop. But it was more that intensity of rain last year, whereas this year it's more, as I say, around solar radiation.
And you mentioned like drought prepping. I know you said that rainfall, obviously high rainfall there is something that you struggled with, but what is your water security like on your property? Because you do have periods of time there where you will go into drought as well.
Water security is not an issue off the back of sheep don't consume huge amounts of water. And in any sort of normal season, they get most of their water needs from the pastures themselves. And even with a few hundred sheep, there's still not a huge requirement for water. Like there'd be 5 million litres worth of water sitting in dams on the property.
Yeah, right.
Which is going to feed the sheep if it doesn't rain for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
Water the sheep. So that's certainly, water security in our landscape's more of a focus. And that's where we try and shift it. People sort of get hung up on harvestable rights and how much they're allowed to keep in dams and things like that. But it sort of removes their focus from the landscape as a whole. And we're sort of looking at how much runs off our property and how much of it is actually infiltrating. And it is difficult in a landscape denuded of trees, and you go into a dry period. Our high clays throw most of the water away pretty quickly. Like it's very hard to get that sort of infiltration, especially when you sort of end a extended dry period with a massive rainfall event, which always seems to be the case. It's we don't get a nice soaking lead up rain for a week. We generally get 100 mil for the day after 3 months without rain. So our usable water is very limited from that, unless there's sort of been ways that we've managed our landscape and created buffer zones and layers within that of a contour system to really try and de-energise that on a whole landscape system. We're not sort of considering just the gullies and those sort of things. In our drainage areas, if we're sort of trying to fix the erosion and damage in a gully, the horse has already bolted. That's the way we sort of look at it. We're sort of trying to de-energise that water well before that point, and try and create that capacity for the water to get into the landscape, so we're not in drought the week after major rain, which is a reality a lot of coastal people face.
There's a really cool aerial shot of your hill. I don't know what part of that property you call that part. That's really cool. Can you go into that a little bit and like the concept behind that? That's obviously to slow and sink water, but it has multiple functions as well.
Yeah, so I suppose what you're referring to would be sort of the spiral paddock, or S5. I've called it. I sort of name the paddocks based on their compass points and just a random number sort of thing, so we can try and explain where things are. But this one's the highest point in the landscape, and unusually on our property, had no trees on it. It had been removed. So a lot of the coastal areas, your hillsides still have the trees there. So this one here, not steep but undulating, we've sort of looked at, rightio, how do I start my impact high and slow, but consider the design around it. Consider it, how do I sort of facilitate density of tree plantings, and then strips of on contour cropping or livestock impact, and then move back to connecting the remnant vegetation to larger parts of our landscape to increase the edge effect, and then moving down to another strip of pastures and livestock. And then so you're sort of working your way down in layers through the landscape from a topographical point of view, I think.
Yeah.
So it's working as an on-contour system. So, and also what you're doing with water. Sometimes it's about moving the water away from a certain area, but it's very slowly. I said a spiral, because the beauty of this, if I went as a pure on-contour, I'd just end up back where I started when I came around the hill, which would be fine. But where do I get into the top of the hill? So the spiral actually enables an opening. So it's a practical sense of management. And also a spiral just slowly moves water to that more western side. I'm sort of got that nice, the eastern side is quite protected by trees and gets quite wet and moist, whereas the western side's more impacted by the afternoon hot sun and the damaging winds from the south and the west, ripping things out. So I'm sort of looking at how do I slowly move more of the water to that side, just small subtle moves in the landscape, not major drainage, but just a case of subtly affecting things is what we're trying to do.
Have you got any other projects that you're currently working on the property that you want to share?
Yeah, we're primarily looking at how do we get a lot more trees in our landscape. And I think that's sort of, in every aspect of it. We've got a market garden system we're putting in place over the last 12 months, but how do we integrate trees into that system more? Rather than just having an open paddock, because I really don't feel like working in a market garden in an open paddock in the hot sun. It doesn't sound like I'm going to give that a miss. So, but how do we have more long-term perennials within our food system? But also we're still going to want to eat lettuce. Well, someone's going to, not myself, but it's a case of it's still something that's part of it. So, you're sort of finding that harmonious balance and benefits from it. You're sort of your lettuce is no longer exposed to hot, dry westerlies because you've got fruit trees on that, on that side. So that's sort of those principles of site sector analysis coming into where what and where you're putting things, and major rain, major sort of wind events from that side. So the physical structure of a netted espaliered orchard in between rows, creates multiple functions, as well as what your roots and your biology is doing under the ground. So you're sort of working in both directions in the beneficial effects, and then across the rest of our landscape, how do we not just fence off areas and grow trees? How do we create trees as an important and integral part of how our system functions? How is our system a net improvement from the trees in the system? How do we incorporate them as part of the fodder? How do we incorporate them as part of the resilience of our property? The multifunctionality of it, I think, is the key point to trees. We sort of got the shade and the interception. Major rain events falling on a tree canopy is going to have far less impact to a drier landscape than if there's just dried off grass that's and set clays. So, and it also means our livestock get to enjoy a better life. We always, during those hot periods, you've sort of got it, you're restricted to where you can take your livestock and where they're sort of enabled, in the property because of smaller pockets of trees. It's not just a case of, how many times we've seen livestock all camped under the one tree in the paddock. Like, it's just nonsense.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it?
It is. So, we sort of look at trying to set aside certain areas of heavy vegetation for those extreme events. But it'd be nice to be able to use our whole property at all times, regardless of whether it's a cold, horrible storm in winter or just 40 degrees for 3 weeks straight in summer. Like, it shouldn't, a major event's an event. So we sort of like, how do you, negate that to a large extent, but also become more beneficial as a whole? How is that actually part of our feed systems and making our property more productive rather than less? And I think that's the hard thing. We've sort of got to shift our focus to what's created as a whole, rather than what we're sort of removing from productivity and that sort of nonsense mindset.
Yeah, we're very good at, like you said, making paddocks and sectioning everything off, aren't we?
Yep. Yeah.
And with your vegetation and your tree planting, are you also using some of that for bushfire management, things like, mulberries and particular varieties?
Well, I think bushfire management for us will be about not heading into a senescent state. And that's the reality of things. Like a lot of our bushfire impacted areas are just old, half dead, senescent types of trees. So trying to have impact by the livestock and keeping that regularity of what's been going on and that sort of the pulses of growth. Because if we ever see a real fire risk here, it's going to be a grass fire. It'll be when you're coming off a bulk of feed out of winter and spring, and then all of a sudden the rain stops, everything dries, and the impact from a grass fire will be so much more because we're more open.
Sure.
Yeah, we're not sort of dense bushland.
Yeah.
But obviously, as we go into creating that sort of tree, it won't be sort of around the specific species, say mulberries that we talk about. It's more around the what's their function. And I think that's like we'd look at having more deciduous trees. So there's more sort of growth and greenery during those drier times.
Yeah.
And also regularly pruning things and keeping pulses of growth, even in the sort of the eucalypts and the various sort of fire-prone things. It's more around keeping that greenery and growth and promoting health rather than just sort of stagnation of the system.
And when you are finding those trees that are unhealthy, you're obviously clearing that, or do you guys do burn backs there as well to help with that, or?
We don't burn any of the tree areas on our property. We do occasionally burn off some of the pastures, and that's just when we've got just a massive density of crap grasses. You sort of your low succession style of grasses in the whiskey grass, and I'm going to stick Soteria in there as well, even though it's considered a production grass, but it just creates so much bulk that it limits the biodiversity. And it's and we sort of look at burning it off and enabling sort of a thinning out of things, so I can then immediately sow in to a much more successful chance of growing something. Trying to grow stuff into a thick mat. And it's also our way of dealing with some of our problems, ticks and internal worms, things like that. We're trying to sort of clean a pasture up, so we've got sort of options for management, so we don't have ewes lambing into a heavy tick burden pasture, or lambs trying to finish that haven't built natural resilience into a heavy burden of into a heavily infested pasture of barber's pole worm. So it's sort of those considerations of it, but it's not just a burn it for the sake of burn it. If I can't see a valid reason for it, or if I have no intention on sending the livestock there, it's like, well, it can sit there. If I'm not going to do something better, don't do anything at all. It's sort of where we like to annoy a few people, I suppose. It's, but it's a fact of it. If there's a huge amounts of woody weeds and stuff growing in an area that's quite wet and horrible, I'm not going to go in and slash the paddock just for aesthetic purposes. If it doesn't promote, if it's isolated from everywhere and there's fire breaks around it, and it's not going to be impact anyone if it gets something catches alight. I don't care. I consider that sort of some build of long-term health in things. Counter to that, obviously, we're always trying to grow green leaves as we can, but if it's sort of I've got to accept my limitations of what we can do. I'm sort of not going to spend all my life on a tractor trying to mow the lawn, so to speak. It's more around accepting that that's a heavy mulch, and there's probably a better impact from that than trying to grow green leaves. If I'm coming into a dry period or it's winter and it's all just sort of a subtropical system, I've got to accept what's actually in that paddock and what's going to happen, not what I just wish would happen, I suppose.
And besides the sheep, do you have other animals there that you kind of integrate into your systems to support the sheep, or other things you're doing on the property?
Yeah, well, Brett's got me onto the heritage turkeys.
Of course he does.
So he's got a pretty hard sell on those. He's sort of talked me for a while, and I've pushed back on most poultry. I don't, they're more difficult to manage in our system, I suppose. Sure. So what we've but the heritage turkeys have enabled a very open range, I suppose we would talk, system. They get let out in the morning. We have to keep them up at night, otherwise the foxes will take them all out. But they're let out in the morning and it's pretty free range. It's a case of just assessing what I need to protect from them and leaving them go at everything else and creating a healthier environment for them from that. Because I've got the snow peas, I've got a big cheap net around them because the snow peas will disappear in 10 seconds from those buggers, but the and the parsley. But the potatoes, they just look at them and don't go near them.
Yeah.
So they walk through and clean up bugs and insects, and and that's what I sort of loved about it. I needed something that I can work harmoniously in the system and not have to segregate.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're not going to let chickens into the market garden. It's
just not and so many people do, though. They just get chickens and they go, oh, that'll be great for our, pest burden in our garden beds. And then they've scratched everything up. And I know, Brett talks a lot about, finding what their behaviours are and making sure that they fit with the system that you're going to integrate them into. Otherwise, you're making it hard on yourself, aren't you?
Absolutely, and that's sort of that back to that observational thing. Sitting there watching the turkeys at Brett's place just slowly walk past the pumpkin vines and walk past the various things. And like, well, hang on a minute, they're not just out for wanton destruction like chickens. They're, it's something that can function. And I say because of that philosophy we have with everything we do is trying to integrate rather than segregate. And if we're bringing, that's why I'd love to have pigs. I'm a huge fan of bacon, but it's just got, there's too much segregation with them. And that's not to say I'll never have them, but I'm not going to have the pigs free ranging the property. That's for sure.
Yeah.
It'll be a case of maybe there'll be a rotation of the livestock. And that's sort of different ways to look at it. Like the sheep were in the market garden there early winter, because I just didn't have the time to get onto it. So let's just send the sheep in and get rid of everything, give it all a big clean up, because why would I bother doing it with a lawnmower when I've got a 200 sheep that can do the job and convert into more fertility. So it's how you and off they go. So I suppose it's that rotation of things for different animals, but also having the turkey sitting there poking around beside you, trying to investigate what you're up to, and there's a nice feel to it as well. Whereas Lammy, our potty sheep, would love to come and sort of be working the market garden with me too, but she will eat the entire market garden that day. So it's not a reality. So it's, I suppose, not acknowledging the importance of animals in our landscape, but working out and being real about which ones we can openly work with, and what are the implications of different sort of species.
I think goats are another one that people go, oh, they're so cute, I'm going to get a goat. Next minute, they've ringbark trees and they're on top of your car.
And that's the reality to it, isn't it? Like it's a case of being real about it. What's the impact?
Totally. So we're coming up towards the end of the interview now, and something we ask all of our guests is if someone else was starting out on this permaculture journey, what advice would you give them?
Well, I think obviously do your PDC. It's a given. It's not the end, and that's the thing people need to acknowledge as well. It can be a start to your journey, or depending on where, and even if you've sort of got a familiarity with permaculture, it suppose holds you accountable for considering things. And especially one like Brett's, where you're working on your own property and you're sort of really considering your own landscape, rather than just being a sort of ideology, I think ultimately important. So, but a sort of spend some time on your own property and just take the time to smell the roses, so to speak, and actually look and observe and see what's happening and work out what you're trying to force on your environment and what parts you're trying to sort of work harmoniously with. And that's the trick, I think.
Well, just from you talking about your systems and what you have going on there, it sounds like you have implemented so many of those principles and really thought about how they impact your land. I guess that comes from that farming headspace that, you need to have all that data to make decisions about your property and those kinds of things. But I think it's really cool to see how it can work on a larger scale as well compared to an urban or, couple acres. And like you said, think about it as a whole system and how everything's working together, on your property.
Absolutely. I think it's the whole we need to look more at, don't we? We sort of look in isolation so much, and permaculture definitely guides us to a better way of assessing that, assessing the parts, but seeing how it fits to a greater whole.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today about what you guys are doing over there. And if people do want to kind of get in contact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Oh, email, phone call. Always happy to share ideas. Websites pretty open to details. So we always encourage someone chasing up some thoughts by all means.
Cool. And I'll put the links to the workshops that you guys are doing in the show notes if anybody wants to jump in and have a look at that. And if you're in your area, how can they get your produce?
Well, it depends on how active we are in producing, I suppose, is the trick. But in the local shop in town, people generally is sort of our main go-to these days, and we'll sort of look at other systems down the track. So we're sort of looking at our production systems rather than our marketing systems at the moment. So looking at sort of how do we set up for the long term, which disappoints some, but we sort of don't try and push it too hard until we're ready to have regularity to what we're doing. That's the reality of it.
Yeah, I guess 8 years is a very small section of time, and you're doing something like what you're doing. It's a very long-term thing.
Yeah, sort of looking at that stability, and you sort of you can rush things, and then you sort of get locked in working in the business rather than on the business before you know what happened, and that's sort of in farming that can be a pretty hectic trap to be caught in.
Yeah, I think as a consumer that's really important to understand too, the time and the effort and the knowledge that goes into what you guys do. People don't just whack some seeds in the ground or chuck some sheep in a paddock and off we go.
Yep, there's some factors involved, that's for sure.
Well, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll chat to you again soon.
Awesome. Great to talk, Elise. Talk soon.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Permaculture podcast. Jump onto our Facebook group to keep the chat going and to look for any resources that we mentioned on today's show. Look in the show notes.
And if you liked the episode today, then subscribe. Please give us a review and share. And if you didn't, then that's okay. We're sure you'll find the right podcast for you.
Bye.
Bye.